So identification is a process of becoming, just like the self is a process of becoming. But interesting that Freud links this to the notion of attachment. That our sense of self, meaning our ego, our conscious ego, and our critical faculty, meaning what's responsible for moral judgment, as well as right and wrong, as well as the notion of valuation, ideality. These are things that drive us. I mean, think of the notion of democracy. The notion of freedom is so important to people. Of course it's important to people, but to the degree that they're willing to lay their life down for it. No one wants to be enslaved. No one wants to be in bondage. But this also applies to the notion of ideas. Somebody doesn't want to be restricted in the way they think, feel, perceive, behave. That people are willing to fight for that. But all these things come from something more primordial. Before there's a sense of self, before there is a moral agency that stands over the self, that judges, that critiques, we have unconscious processes that are driving all of this, and hence Freud's term Trieb, which is drive, Trieb in German. The notion of a drive, not instinct. Instinct is a mistranslation, but we often say instinct because something's innate, something's instinctual, it's innate. But the notion of a drive is what Freud's talking about, that unconsciously we are driven, meaning that there are certain impulses, there's certain types of compulsions, there are certain motivations that are unconsciously operative outside of our awareness and are influencing the way we think, feel, perceive, behave. How is it that you meant to say one thing but something else came out of your mouth? It's only on the condition that it was an accident that you would say that, because it offended somebody. Hence, unconsciously, the censor barrier wanted to be free, want to express itself, even though consciously you're trying to fight that. It comes out as a slip. These are not just linguistic mess-ups, at least not always, but there's a certain type of unconscious communication there. And they can be quite comical, even to ourselves. So Freud, he revolutionized the way we think about the mind, about human nature, about behavioral science, not to mention culture, religion, gender. It's been said that no one since Jesus has been more controversial or compelling. Why is it that he's left his mark on society? I mean, it's become his language has become, part of popular culture to the degree that you wouldn't even know it. The term libido, usually used, for sex drive. In German, it means lust. But really, more basically, it's a notion of desire, or eros, going back to the Greeks. Desire has no bounds, but it always appears bounded. It means it has to attach to an object, whether that be a human being, whether that be a fantasy, whether that be part objects like little things that we have that we like to collect. They all serve psychic functions to us. So the notion of unconscious drives are very important because in one way they're very evolutionarily defined. That we're social animals. We cannot deny our embodiment. So Freud offers a very sophisticated way of understanding the psychobiology of mind by introducing the notion of drives. So if there are people that feel that this is, I don't like that. They have various arguments that think that somehow by talking about our biological processes that strips the notion of the human away. So various phenomenological existential movements have focused on the person, not on the drives, not on the unconscious. But in reality, the two aren't mutually exclusive at all. I mean, they're very much complementary. We want to understand what's going on. Well, it's not just simply base instinct that he's talking about. He's talking about a dynamic unconscious that is comprised of all of our experiences that the ego has, the self has, that we internalize over time, and they become deposited, so to speak, metaphorically, into an unconscious reservoir. They also are taken up by a number of other internal processes that develop. And so the unconscious is not simply drives, but it's also a cacophony of internalized objects, meaning what we identify with, what we introject, and what we experience is now within our mind on a deep layer that's not always accessible to us. Just like memory, we don't always remember things. But under the right conditions, we can retrieve it. We can retrieve a fragment of a memory. So in this sense, that the unconscious is a storehouse of memorializations, of what have been memorialized within us. And they can come out in a variety of different ways, but really they're the foundation of our personalities. So all the things that we also don't like about ourselves and about others, about bad experiences we've had, about impulses that we find to be unacceptable or painful, we instituted a series of defenses. Freud referred to these initially as resistances, but they can become quite sophisticated in their various forms they take. So, for instance, Freud talked about repression. That we repress certain things that we don't want to remember because they're painful. In today's language, we refer to that as dissociation. However, Freud's first model of the mind was based upon dissociation. When he was writing in his early years, his studies in hysteria, 1896, with Joseph Breuer, where he had a dissociative model of mind before developing a repressive model. Both are operative. One seems to be favored today, hence trauma studies and things like this. The basic notion is that you haven't really been able to bring to consciousness and articulate certain internal experiences. Well, that's the same for repression. That there are certain active forces that are keeping certain things at bay from entering into our conscious mind. And it's because we've instituted certain types of protective mechanisms. We call them, for popular vernacular, coping mechanisms. But that's what we do. We have to protect ourselves. So we institute these kinds of defensive structures. Why is this all important? Because these are the very things that bring people into your treatment. They have certain rigid defenses. They could be very superego based, like this is the way things are, they can't be anything else. But that kind of rigidity is what keeps people from not functioning or adapting very well. Why are you having problems in your relationship? Because you're so rigid in the way you think and feel and behave that you can't allow other people to have different points of view or have different experiences than your own. You're so threatened by it, you have to vilify the other person. Hence, you're creating nothing but conflict with human beings wherever you go, whether it be in your relationships, whether it be with your kids, whether it be with your coworkers, and you wonder why you've been fired, why you've been divorced twice, and why you feel you have very few friends, if any at all. And you come in with this sense of malaise about your life. And people don't see the connection until it's presented to them. And then they have to look at these things. Do you have a thought? No. So the notion of an unconscious is extremely important because this is what you're going to be witnessing in various ways in your work with patients. How they manifest, Freud believed that he bought into a Kantian model of the psyche, in the sense that the unconscious was the Ding und sich, the thing in itself. We can never know the thing in itself. We can only know what appears. So we're not going to know the unconscious directly. We're going to know how it appears to us. So how it appears is through defenses, through symptoms, through slips, through dreams, and yet it's communicating very important elements of the person, whether that be their values, whether that be their internal conflicts. When people want to be quick to dismiss the relevance of Freud today, I simply just like to point out that every psychiatric disorder that's in the DSM would have originated in some form from his ideas. You name it. We might have new inventions, but nevertheless they would be offshoots of some of his original discoveries. His work on what we used to call neurosis, we now call it anxiety disorders, we call it obsessive compulsive disorders. These all come from him. The notion of psychosis, of melancholia, hence depression, of mania, even little things like trichotillomania, people who pull their hair out, are obsessional neuroses, obsessional compulsive processes. The notion of defense mechanisms, the notion again of infantile sexuality. People think children aren't sexual. They get hung up on the term sexual. Well, sexual isn't at all necessarily about adult sexuality, about genital copulation. We're talking about our body. If any of you have children or have been around small children, you will see that they're fascinated with their body. You will see small children exploring their body in all kinds of ways, and exploring the bodies of their little friends in ways too. So there's something natural, so to speak, about this epistemological curiosity of our bodies, to such a degree as that it's now become unconscious, and we take it for complete face value. Why do you think we have such an industry that's based upon fashion, sex, marketing? It's all appealing to human desires. It's all appealing to images and appearances and what you would like to be, like you would like to become, whether it be having the perfect body, going to the gym, eating. This is a certain standard of which people look up to. Here you go. Here's the super ego identification with the idealized object that's out there. And then people kind of unconsciously, or to use your term, they have become socially conditioned, like Pavlov's dogs, to want to be like that thing on the TV. And again, because it's unconsciously, they're, and it usually begins in childhood, they're living up to these images. So when my 11-year-old is, got her little iPad and fascinated with all these little teen pop stars, and what do you say? You say, oh, well, she's going to be an anorexic when she gets older. Or she's probably already, like a pathological human being to begin with. No, I don't say those things. I say things like, turn that rap off. That's the one rule in my house. I don't want to hear it. So, the notion of, ask yourself one question. What are the two most prevalent things that we as a society are fascinated with or experience every day? The two things, let me rephrase it. What are the two things that are most basic to all of us? Anybody have a thought on that? Anger? Okay. What? Food? Connect? Okay. Well, acceptance? What? Security? Well, besides a couple basics, the rest seem to be a little bit more developed. So, for instance, anger and food. Okay, well, yes, we all have to have food. The notion of anger is a primordial emotion. Where does that come from? The notion of acceptance and connection with others, where does that come from? They come from something earlier. The two most basic aspects of the human psyche is sex and aggression. So, if we just empirically ask an empirical question, we cannot deny the fact that the number one commodity on the internet is porn. In the entire world, people are looking at sexual images more than anything else. Now, of course, this might be a bunch of guys in the back jacking off. But the mere fact that that is the number one industry seems to speak about itself, given that we are more preoccupied with sexual intimacies with people. And what that means also is the extension of libidinal motivations is attachment to people, connection to people, feelings of security with people. These are all sublimations or modifications of libidinous functions, of desire. Aggression is so indisputable. The number one thing that you see on the news every night is death, destruction, aggression, some form of negativity is being perpetrated throughout the world. If you were to sit there with a little counter and you watch the evening news that comes on, ting, click, 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 everything that every little news story, except for the very end, they have, Sammy the whale that we've saved on the beach, or some little puppy, or something to make sure that the psyche is, elevated at the end, and something nice, show a baby's face, and then we all feel good. The notion of marketing is marketing these kind of basic desires. So, whether it be, the macho man, that's a form of like, what does it mean to be a man? It means to be competitive, it means to be athletic, it means to be dominant, it means to be this, that, this. And we formulate these types of early identifications, often based upon gender roles that we don't really think about. They just are there. And then later in life you go, wow, I identified with that because that was the only game in town. That's what guys are supposed to be doing. And it's such a caricature that people even speak in terms of this today. They speak about women are this way, men are this way, until you get into the transgender movement, where these people feel more comfortable floating in and out of roles. But still, unconsciously, you probably identify with yourself as a gender. We are engendered as we are embodied. So the point here is that Freud wanted to locate, understand higher order phenomenon, mental phenomenon, from its more organic basis. So in many ways it's very compatible with contemporary evolutionary thinking, that we have evolved from our animal species, we become human, and with that is that we cannot deny the fact that we are embodied, that we have certain libidinal and aggressive drives that we then must channel. And how do we channel this? We channel this through ego and superego activity. But more specifically, we channel that through a very complicated yet sophisticated series of defenses. And that's what constitutes our character structure. That's what constitutes our personalities. So we have various ways of viewing the world, viewing the self, of functioning in the world, of adapting based upon certain types of defenses that we've employed. Some are going to be more dominant than others. Some are going to be more effective than others. And this is what's very fascinating about the human being, because on one hand, we all have, or we all participate of a common psychic substructure, but we are all uniquely individual. So that's why our personalities are different. Even though we may have commonalities, we may have shared values and visions and desires, we still are fundamentally different than other people. So you are your own norm, is what I'm trying to say here. Unlike what we are often taught, that this is normal and this is abnormal, Well, what Freud is saying is that what's normal, meaning normative, is that the psyche is going to naturally have these properties and attributes, that they naturally are going to lead to certain levels of functionality, but at the same time, whether you like it or not, folks, you can't escape from the fact that you're going to have internal conflicts. And internal conflicts is part of being human. The Greeks referred to it as pathos, as suffering. To be human is to suffer, and to find various ways of ameliorating our suffering, coping with it, is the task of civilization. And just like the task of civilization is to create certain social structures that allow us to prosper, to function, we also have to have an internal structure that allows us to do this. So Freud continues to elaborate how there is the interface between the unconscious aspects of ourselves, which we can't fully know in and of itself, but we are alerted to it through its appearances. And that part of ourselves forms a certain type of tension with our conscious sense of self. And our conscious sense of self also involves our moral sensibility, or what we feel is right and wrong, what we feel is just, what we feel is an ideal or a value that we feel that we want to live up to, and that we employ and that we also cast aspersions upon others with these ideals, because they often are going to clash with other people's ideals and other people's values. Hence the uniqueness of the psyche, and the uniqueness of certain societies that can emerge that value some ideals over others, to the degree that cultures can be so radically different and pitted against one another based upon the fact that they have different superego functions. So Freud famously, in this particular essay on the dissection of the personality, you may have heard about this or read about this before, but he says that he's just approaching the notion of the id, the ego, superego, or the it, the I, the over I, as analogies. These are metaphors. So you don't want to look at it as some reified thing that's in the head, but metaphorically, these are processes that are operative in our psyches, in our minds. And he refers to them. We call it chaos, meaning the unconscious, a cauldron full of seething excitations. So we picture it as being open at its end to somatic influences, meaning our body, and as they're taking up into its instinctual needs, which find their psychical expression in it, meaning that we express ourselves through our bodies. I mean, our bodies communicate, in other words, unconscious desires and conflicts. So people call, let's say, they call it stress. When you're not feeling well, you're stressed. What's that mean? It means you're feeling anxious. It means your body feels anxious. And people somatize all the time. There are certain types of people who are more likely to somatize as an experience of their own depressed affect than they are to experience the mood of the depressed affect. So they feel constant fatigue. They have things like fibromyalgia. They have chronic fatigue syndrome. Or you have irritable bowel syndrome. or you have stomach problems. People get migraine headaches. This is like the new neurosis. These are all expressions, or I mean, not always. Let's say, I don't want to make a blanket statement, but let's say if they are under the influence of psychic conflict, these are somatic manifestations of the conflict. So in many cultures, it's much more acceptable to have physical illnesses and ailments than it is to have psychological ones. So you see this a lot in South Asian populations and Asian populations, where they have all these physical ailments, but they're not talking about the fact that they're feeling depressed psychically until you start probing around. So what Freud also wants to conclude is that the task of us as self-aware individuals is to make the unconscious conscious. That we, in order to understand more about who we are, but let's say in the context of the clinic, when you're meeting with patients who are presenting with a variety of different psychological problems, that they don't really understand themselves. They don't really have insight into their condition. And hence, it's only through the coming into presence of an understanding of our interior that we are going to have insight into who we are and what is motivating or causing our psychological conflicts. So what Freud, in his famous ending to his essay, says in the English, where id was, there ego shall be. In the German is wo ist war, soll ich werden, really means, to translate, where it was, there I shall become. So I'm a process of becoming. I'm emerging as a more self-aware human being. So I don't have to let my internal unconscious conflicts dominate who I am. But once I become more aware of the source and the motivation of my pathos, of my symptoms, I will then have more knowledge, and hence you can only be free through self-knowledge. It really is a return to the notion, or the Socratic notion, of know thyself, the Delphic decree. That's why the Greeks put such emphasis on education, on self-awareness and self-knowledge, because they saw that through that people can live and function in much more healthier ways. So, in a nutshell, I wanted to introduce you to this because it will form a backdrop of the the material we're going to be covering in the course. In various ways, it's presupposed that if you take as an assumption that human beings who present are never going to be what they appear to be, you're going to be looking for other aspects, and you take as an assumption that they don't fully understand themselves, and that your job here, your role, is to be a catalyst, is to facilitate their own process of becoming. And I think that that's a modest goal, as well as a modest role to have as a therapist.